what Trump tried to say yesterday and tried to use as leverage said, states, I don't want you to do this. But there are going to be a lot of states. I mean, California's just had a new initiative, and they're even proliferating city level initiatives that for a variety of reasons they're going to push back and they're going to say no, we're going to do it our way. And from a regulatory point of view, I used to be a trade official back in the olden days, and our job was to harmonize regulations, right? Because otherwise you couldn't get scale. And so it seems to me is we could end up with a checkerboard of regulations across the US, which will actually impede getting to scale. And the only way, saying no regs is not the answer. There has to be some kind of actual effort at harmonization.
Definitely. I think you're exactly right. And, that has happened on privacy, for example. There has been very, interesting laws across the states, and sometimes they'll copy each other. So there's a little bit of harmony, but really there isn't, and it frustrates the companies, which is understandable. But every time it gets to a place where it can be a federal law, these issues, federal preemption becomes a problem, or the private right of action becomes a problem. And, there are solutions. There are ways to come to the same place, with some compromise, but it just never happens. And I think that's really unfortunate, because there doesn't seem to be that voice in Congress anymore or that sort of path towards compromise. And on AI, it feels like the stakes are so much bigger. I mean, privacy is a part of that, but the stakes are really huge. And I've heard from global partners in Singapore and Japan and lots of places just how important it is that the US has lost ground here. That we are no longer, not just, in the various ways that this has happened with tariffs and free speech, et cetera, but just that we are no longer a governance thought leader, that we are not that standard for human rights, for, some other aspects of governance is a really big deal. And, so I think there's still this hope that we will, that we will come to the table at some point. But I don't think I can stress enough how much that is disturbing to our allies.
It looks like we're, operating under the Churchillian formula of perhaps getting to the right answer, but only after having exhausted all the other options, right?
Right, like everything will fall apart, right? And then we'll kind of crawl to the table. Yeah, that's not ideal.
Well, let me take two of those, because two of the areas where some places in the world are dealing with it, but we don't apparently want to. One is, yesterday Trump was talking about intellectual property, and he was like saying, well, it's just not, I mean, as if he'd actually thought this through, right? But he said, well, it's just not practical to, go and when you're, training large language models, give some rights to the people whose content you're using to train them. And I'm sure he hasn't thought that through. I'm sure somebody told him that. But if the administration's position is we're entering a new era in the age of intellectual property, where if you're using the IP in AI, you don't own it anymore. Which doesn't seem, I mean, to me, that seems not feasible. Contrary to the opposite of what he said. What do you think?
Yeah, I didn't understand. Yeah, I mean, I don't think the position was articulated in that sense, and I don't really feel like the administration has taken one on this. But I'm not sure. I could be wrong. I'm not an expert in intellectual property, but I agree with you that this is such an important issue, and there's really been no thought leadership at all in this, and I think all we've seen is basically pro-industry, right? So whatever that looks like, which is, pro kind of litigation, pro Google, right? Pro just kind of coming after and protecting the LLMs at all cost, right? So the lack of really digging into the sort of complexity of these cases, the Google search case, et cetera, the New York Times. So I don't, the only thing I can say, I think, in terms of the stakes, I think, are really huge. Whether or not these training data sets are proprietary, the information in them will basically make or break this industry, right? And yet you hear
Well,
nothing from the administration about it.
well, it
Right?
also poses a new kind of question, right? Which
Yeah,
is the meta IP question. And I'm not referring to the company, although it could be.
yeah,
And the meta IP question is this: LLMs or other kinds of AI models train themselves on all the work of all the artists in history, all the writers in history,
mm-hmm.
and they create something which then future AI could train itself on. Who owns that? You know, who who owns the product of the brain of ChatGPT or I mean we're getting into pretty sophisticated AI produced animations and
Yeah, oh yeah,
CGI and all this other kind of stuff.
yeah,
If you're taking industry side, presumably, if your company is developing that stuff, you want to own it, even though you stole all of the component parts of it to
yeah.
begin. I don't know. It seems like a tension to me.
I think it's a really tricky question, right? I mean, because at what point does it become something new is at the heart of all of it. The common rules, it's when is it other people's, and then when does it become something new? Because it does become something new at a certain point, right? It does when the LLM has ingested enough data, it turns it into, the courts have said, and I think it's fair to say, something different, right? When you see the LLMs create, I don't know, maybe art is the best way, or a new piece of music, or whatever, it does, at least according to the courts, and something different. And so I think that is the tension: is when does that happen? And of course, we don't understand much about these models at all. To be able to look at any kind of moment in them is impossible. So that's a big part of it too. So we just look at what we do understand, which is these training sets and the weights, and trying to figure out where we could sort of pinpoint something. And so all of it is in a way ridiculous. It's I think almost impossible for us to do that. So the courts are left with sort of incomplete knowledge about this almost mystical system that even its engineers don't understand, trying to answer this really complicated legal and technical question. I mean, I think what it's going to come down to, and in an evolving system at the same time, so it's kind of chasing something that's constantly changing. I think it's going to come down to, basically, it's going to have to evolve with it. It's going to have to be sort of, there are times when it is this and times when it is not this, and that will change. And, I think the law is very uncomfortable with that type of thing. Policy is very
Well,
uncomfortable with that type of situation. It's circumstantial, basically, when there's a circumstance in which it is and when it isn't. I think that's it's very difficult for law and policy to handle those.